So I just started recording, Rachel.
Okay, great.
So I see there's another person who signed in.
I can see that too, yes.
Hi, do you mind identifying yourself?
Hi, this is Adia. Sorry, I'm trying to mute myself.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Adila Mayat.
Hey, Adila, how are you?
Hey, how are you guys? Hi, Rachel. It's so lovely to see you.
Good to see you too. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm so excited that we are getting to learn from you again.
Oh my goodness. I'm excited to be re-engaged on this platform. It's amazing. Thank you.
Of course, wouldn't miss it.
Great.
Are we still waiting for many people? Do I need to mute myself? How does this work?
So mute yourself just so we don't have any background sounds, but we promised last week we would start promptly at 6:30. So say we should start and whoever is going to join us will join us. I think there's just 2 people on the call, right, Khotso?
Yes, and so we were expecting 7, but then 2 cancelled, but then Adila joined. So we'll see how many people.
So 6. Okay. Yeah. And who's the other person who's on the call, apart from Adila?
Apart from Adila and Daniel, that's a good question.
Yeah, because there's 5 of us here.
Oh, this is Lerato. Lerato Shai.
Oh, hi, hey, Lerato. Lerato, can you hear us?
Oh, she said, sorry, she's being muted by me. So I'm gonna unmute. And then.
Hi, Lerato.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Good. So which Lerato is this? Because I know lots of Leratos from the foundation.
I was based in Cape Town when you were.
Okay, what's your last name?
Shai.
Okay, fantastic. Lerato and Adila, Lerato, were you on the call last week?
I couldn't join, unfortunately. My mom was visiting at the time.
Okay, no problem, because what I said we should do to start off for anyone who hadn't joined last week is to do the same introduction which we did last week. So just to say, you know, what are you doing right now? What would be your expectations for such a platform? And then finally, if you saw yourself getting into any entrepreneurial space, which space interests you? So if you can just both do that for now, so I can just note it, and then we can begin.
Lerato, do you want to go first?
Sure. Cool. So I'm currently working as a public sector consultant with a firm based in Cape Town called PDG. I'm an economist by training, and expectation. So I wanted to be part of this course because it looked very different to the normal, to all the other stuff we've been exposed to in the foundation, and it looked like it was coming at a more context-based approach. So really trying to understand the continent, and that's been one of my themes for the last couple of years, at least from a reading perspective. So I've been reading solely or exclusively literature around the continent, so I wanted to take that spin as well on an entrepreneurial side. In terms of a space, I haven't settled on anything, but I would like to look into literature or reading or books or something in and around there, whether that's technology or something else. But yeah, I want to explore that a bit more. And especially around the stereotypes that Black people don't read, or there's something I want to challenge that and question that and see if there's any entrepreneurial activities in and around that. Cool.
Great. Great.
Sure, and Lerato, this is Hoto. I remember when you presented this great idea a couple of years back. It was almost like Goodreads, where people can find African literature all in one place on the internet.
Yeah,
It was
with
lovely.
Akasua. Yes. It's on pause.
Oh, did you want to do this with Akosua?
Yes, Akos and I worked on an idea, and then we both paused it for a while, and we both it's still in the air, but we'll see how. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. Thank you, Lerato. Adila?
Hi. Okay, so at the moment I'm working in an SME, local SME that develops renewable energy projects for the private sector and sources funding for them. My expectation for this course, or I think maybe let me, similar to Lerato, state where I'm interested in going in the longer term, and that will probably line up with why I'm actually interested in this course specifically. So I noticed in the renewable energy sector and in a lot of infrastructure projects, which are sort of booming across Africa, it's become a gold rush for foreign investors. And although, especially in South Africa, we've seen a massive growth in an industry that wasn't there, 20 years ago, we have not seen it in a diverse manner. And in spite of the fact that it's not a legacy industry, it's not mining or agriculture, it's a new industry, it's still highly untransformed, and the transactional value or the investment value is really very much European, American, and Eastern as well. So I'm currently working with two other fellows on a venture that we hope will turn into a small business that seeks to address this amongst other issues in the sustainability space. But my interest really lies in trying to understand African capital, Western aid in Africa. I think that's what caught my eye most about this this course, is that it's something that's been spoken about, but I want to try and understand it a lot more. And yeah, basically, just as I mentioned earlier, Rachel, if you're talking, I'm listening. So really, really keen to hear your insights from everything you've experienced.
Oh, thank you, Adila. I feel a lot of pressure now that you've said that.
No.
But that's a good thing. So thank you, Adila. Kotso, did you want to add? Did I hear your voice there for a second? No. Okay. Okay. So this week we are looking at exploring the entrepreneurial mindset, right? Which is, of course, as you know, the thing that's going to launch you into whatever it is that you end up innovating, whatever it is that you end up creating, whatever it is that you end up improving, whatever it is in creating the product that you'll end up selling, whatever that looks like. And I suppose my first question, how I wanted to do this, was to first hear from you what two things struck you from the videos that we had. We had a lot more videos this week than anything else, but we also had readings, a few readings. I found the material extremely rich, some of it even divergent, but really interesting from a theoretical perspective, and then we'll apply it as well to practice. But I'd be interested to hear from you, what were two things, if you did manage to look at the material, that struck you? We can list those, and then we can go back to each one and basically thrash it out for a few minutes and then take out our big ahas at the end of it. And also what would be great is if all of us are able to share what practical experiences we've had on the ground based on this material that we've read. I certainly, as an entrepreneur, have had quite a few epiphanies, disagreements with some of the videos or the readings. But yeah, so we can have a conversation about that. So let me just hand it to you and say, what two things struck you? And anyone can go.
Okay,
Sure, I'll
so
just quickly start this. Go ahead. Sorry.
okay, go for it.
Go ahead, Adila.
So go for it.
Oh, sure. So I was just saying two things for me. So one was, this was more in the additional content. So I don't know if anyone had a chance, but they might have read this book before, Zero to One,
Yes.
about how competition is just fundamentally unhealthy, or the obsession with competition in business can be very unhealthy and doesn't always lead to additional value being created. But we do have a monopoly. Monopolies have traditionally been bad, but when we do have a monopoly that's focused on increasing the consumer's value, then that can be a good thing. An example of that is Google. Then the second thing that surprised me as well was, so in terms of setting up your own founding team, so hiring your friend or your family isn't always a good thing.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Khotso. Those are good points to start with. Yeah. Okay. Who wants to go next?
So I'll go. I unfortunately did not get too deep into the content. It was more an overview, but I will certainly come better prepared in the future. The one thing I did note, though, is the section on responsible entrepreneurship. And this is something that I feel like, in my experience, until you question or are exposed to certain elements of responsible entrepreneurship, you sometimes have the mindset of, learning from the way things have been done before and not questioning things that seem a little bit dodgy to you. And things that I've struggled with previously is collusion versus industry collaboration. I really struggle with the lines there, and I'm very confused by it. So I was quite excited to see that responsible entrepreneurship keeps coming up. And then the other one that I also struggle with is the application of BE, which I know is a tired topic. But
Say that again, Adina. The what topic?
It's a bit of a tired topic, but application of BE in the South African context.
Okay.
And whether it's the application or the system, or how can it be applied in a way that is responsible and that is that is trying to reach the objectives that were set with it, and why does the industry struggle with that? Why is fronting and all of that still very, very much front of mind, really? So yeah, those are sort of my two issues that I'm dealing with now. But yeah, responsible entrepreneurship is the thing that kind of pricked my ears in this one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adila. Lerato?
Sure. I did not get a chance at all to look at any of the material. This week was a bit crazy. But in terms of the book, because I have read 0 to 1 and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I have many ideas about what I fully still remember what I enjoyed most about the book. So I'll just maybe point out one thing, if that was also on the reading material. And it was the idea, I mean, it's the title of the book, but it was the idea of more for more sake, and the definition of innovation, so he has this formula where some companies come in and they just create, they don't move us from 0 to 1, so they don't move us from any position. There's just this multiplication of what's already there in the market or what already exists, and the true innovation actually moves society into a different direction, or it completely changes the way in which we operate. And you find, or at least in my work experience, it's one of the things that tend to frustrate me, especially working for the public sector, is while we all are quite clear that the underlying objective is development and society's progression and dealing with the big three: unemployment, poverty, etc. there's still this lack of, then that's the mindset coming in. There's this lack of wanting to move us from just multiplying methodologies that are tired and don't work, just because that's what we know that's the programs that we know are generally rolled out if you want to address unemployment or poverty. But yeah, anyway, that's just one thing I got out of that.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So I think that we can go down all of these so we can make sure we cover all of them and have a discussion going. For my two, which were really, really fascinating for me, the first one was that the most successful CEOs, the most successful founders, essentially, are the people who are likely much more going to get discarded. So this idea that the more successful your startup is, the more likely your board of advisors or the people around you are going to be looking for the next big win, right? So, and that usually means bringing in fresh ideas and therefore a fresh leader. And so it was this idea that 50% of founders are basically fired halfway through the start of the business, essentially. And that 73% of the time, it's actually driven by the board who want fresh blood. It was quite fascinating. So it was almost like that's really interesting that if you are successful, and I think Steve Jobs is a great example of that, you're actually much more risk of losing your company. I thought that was very interesting. And then the second thing that really resonated with me, because I've had this experience just recently having created a partnership with two other people to create a firm, is that the biggest reason why startups fail, and this was in, what was his name? Noam Wasserman's talk. The biggest reason that startups fail in interpersonal conflict is the fact that new startups don't spend enough time actually working on the interpersonal dynamics. So there's a lot of time that is spent on designing the product, looking at the market, doing that kind of research, but not a lot of thought into intelligent design of the actual startup and the engine, which is the people. And so that 63% of the time is the statistics he gives of why startups fail, is people, is a people thing, which really excited me because a part of my offering as Narachi Leadership is a course for founders to help them think about the people side and how to design an intelligent organization from the people angle. So that really fascinated me. So those are my two. So I think that's going to make for really exciting conversation. So shall we start with I'll take one from each one and so that we all have a chance with each one, but
Sorry, Rick. Sorry, this is Hoto. I just wanted to add Tom as well to give us his perspective. So I'm going to unmute him if you don't mind.
Oh, great. Yes, someone just joined us. I see that. Okay.
You can go ahead, Tom.
Hello. Sorry, I was a bit late today. Hey, so I just caught the end of what you guys were chatting about. So just, I guess, reflections on the content.
Yes.
And I guess
two things that really struck you, that stood out for you in the content.
Okay, so I think in the first reading on I think it was from the Book of Life. The one thing that I disagreed with was, well, maybe it was just the example, but the VW example of a car, how advertising should come first. I think it was. I think it's actually just a bad example. I generally agree with their point that you should focus on problems, not products. And I often hear some people's wacky business ideas of some products that I can't see why anyone would buy it because I don't see what the problem is. So, yeah, that was an interesting point. And then further down on that, also in the Book of Life, the one point that I've never heard before is that 80% of profits should come from the top 20% of our needs. And I just wondered how relevant that was in an African context where so many of our lower needs are not taken care of.
Right. Okay. 20% of profits coming from 20% of needs. I'm just writing that down. Okay, great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for joining.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. So I said I'll give each person their first one, and then we can move to the second one. Khotso, so you had mentioned, I think let's start before we even get to the competition versus monopoly, because that's a bigger question. I mean, let's start from the fundamentals of how you actually start up the business, right? Which is this question of, do you hire friends or family? Do you go as a solo entrepreneur, or do you hire professional buddies, people you've worked with before? And where is the greatest win? Khotso, what struck you about that conversation specifically? And then we can all jump in.
Sure. So I must admit, it's been a while since I've read this content, especially since I read the book a while back before putting the content together. But for me, I'll just give my view of what I think is important, at least. So I think working with people who you've had some kind of professional interaction with before, so even if it's a friend, but you have an idea of how they work, I think that's a good thing. Sort of what struck me about since I came on my journey as an independent consultant was just like people willy-nilly are like, hey, you want to get into a business? I'm like, but I don't know you and you don't know me. But yeah, it's incredible just how much risk people are willing to take. But I think it doesn't matter as long as you've had some kind of exposure to their skill set and attitudes and what motivates them. Well, and then interestingly enough, when I look at what Y Combinator does in terms of what they require as one of the world's most successful accelerators, is they have a preference for a founding team that is more than one person.
Yes.
Because just starting a startup is too hard. So those types of things are interesting.
Absolutely. Okay. Were there any other thoughts on this specific topic?
Yes. I really enjoyed that section of the book as well. And part of the reason why the venture with Akosua was paused was because it was quite evident that our working styles were so different, and which is, with now honest conversation, is not like one of my best friends, because it was something we could easily have a conversation about. And I think it was really a working style difference versus you and I don't actually have the same vision about where the startup is going or what we want to do, etc. But it was a matter of, how do you work? Like, when you say you're going to complete a task or you're going to deliver on a product or a service, how do you go about it? And that was just not working out. But the ability to have that communication and speak openly and freely about it, and be able to say, okay, this is where it's off. Maybe let's just take a pause and we can see how we reconvene. And I feel like it's something that's actually missing, or was missing, in our accelerator program last year. I wanted to actually still chat to the people putting together this year's content, is that none of the sessions actually had a component that had to do with how well does the team work together, and when there's confrontation and conflict, do they have the tools to navigate those conversations, and will they be able to work through all of that, and are we all clear about why we're here and what we're doing? Are we all aligned on that? And if we're not, do we have the tools to work through that? So I think, yeah, that's my thought.
Raka, thank you for that. So we're building the next iteration of the accelerator as the association team and E Squared. So I'll make that note. Thanks.
Cool.
Can I add a comment here as well, Rachel?
Absolutely.
So, Khotso, what you said earlier about people willy-nilly ready to jump into things, I I also struggled a bit in my first few years after varsity when you start to think about entrepreneurship. Well, for me, it was after studies where I could actually focus energies on it, and either having lots of ideas or being around people who have a lot of ideas and, as you say, willy-nilly say, hey, let's do this thing. And oftentimes I found that I was so passionate about the ideas, but for some reason that starter part, the excitement, the first discussion hardly ever progressed to a point. I got into one where we actually did progress a bit, but if 1 month in, I realized something very fundamental, which is that I didn't know this person very well. I didn't know their end goals apart from solving this problem. And based on that, I think what I'm trying to do now with the two other fellows that I mentioned is we've actually flipped it completely on its head and just started working together. So at the moment, we just write a blog. We just touch base for the whole of last year. We just touched base once a month via Skype and spoke about things, so we got to know each other a little bit. And then, now we're starting to set down what do we want to do. And I think someone mentioned, Bharati mentioned, what is your aim here? And we had to have very honest conversations of like, yeah, we want to reduce carbon emissions and do all these really great things. But actually also, honestly, we all want to make money. We all want to have families and be able to. So it's like once you've built that trust and that conversation was much easier. I think this route is slow and maybe painful. It's not as easy as the jumping in, feet first. But I think for me, probably the better way to start off.
That's a brilliant contribution. Thank you, Adila. Okay, Tom, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just one more thing to add. Something I picked up from the Y Combinator lecture series on how to start a startup, where they were mentioning the same topic on not starting with your family or friends as co-founders. There was another point raised that people will often interview their first hire or their first couple of employees a lot more than they will a co-founder. So they'll put a lot more work into figuring out your first employee, if they're the right person. But then I think as people who are entrepreneurially minded, we get so excited when we meet someone who's vaguely interested in your idea that you're so eager to just jump in with them.
Oh, such a rich conversation. So I had a number of thoughts on this because ironically, I mean, this is the work that I do, right? Which is helping people helping organizations on this point of interpersonal conflict, having courageous conversations, really being able to be honest and sometimes brutally so about what the intentions are, what the working styles are, etc. And I find if I then link that to the conversation, Noam's argument, which is that, well, his research showing that it's much better to start off with professional buddies, people you've worked with whose style of work you know, etc., versus family. I mean, I immediately put that into dispute because I think some of the most successful businesses in the world, and I suppose you're not talking sort of big things like Google, etc., but if you look at businesses that have been run over time, over ages, are family businesses. I think the Jews are famous for having family businesses, so are the Chinese, so are the Indians, for example. I mean, we have these stereotypes around the fact that they always start family businesses, even if they're small mama papa businesses, but they thrive for decades, right? And my question was why? I mean, as soon as they made this argument about it doesn't, the family piece doesn't work so well, my immediate question was, well, so why have so many family businesses worked over time? And I think, and I'm open to debate for this, my argument is that it's exactly around the inability to communicate piece. The assumption that people make when they come together with family, which is that you have my interests at heart, you will never do me wrong, you're going to work hard because we are blood. And based on that, they then don't run the business like a business. They run it like it's just a happy-go-lucky thing that we're doing together and we're going to make money while we do it. And I think that's what makes it fail. Not that it's inherently because you started as a family, because there are families that would disprove that theory. Now, to the point that Adila made, there's a science around this. And I think it's unfortunate that business schools and universities don't teach that, which is, how do you build a scientific organization, an intelligent organization based on people science? So McKinsey did this research that basically showed that organizations that have an equal focus on their strategy and on their people, or the soft stuff, quote unquote, as it is called, are 2.5 times more likely to be successful than organizations that just focus on strategy. And I think the trap, and 3 times more successful than the organizations that just focus on the soft stuff, which is like NGOs tend to do that a lot. And so the truth of the matter is, if we learned how to make people stuff a part of our hard strategy, I think that the outcome of these kinds of research would look fundamentally different, right? So one of the things I offer to my clients as a science behind being intelligent around people is personality assessments. Now, personality assessments are not perfect. There's no perfect personality assessment on the planet, but it certainly takes out a lot of guesswork from how human beings are going to behave, right? So the tool I like to use is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's the oldest tool on the market. I came in touch with it when I was at McKinsey because McKinsey uses it religiously. But I then got certified as an MBTI practitioner too. And one of the things that I found intriguing is, it's a personality assessment that's been around since the 40s. So it's been worked on for decades. Initially developed by Carl Jung, who's known as the father of analytical psychology. There's a lot of good thought that went into it. It's not a perfect tool, just like I said, there is no perfect tool. But what's fascinating for me is when I have used the MBTI, I can almost with precision predict how people are going to behave in a certain environment. And I've just been over the last week training an organization that has been around in Zimbabwe since the 40s, an insurance company. And what's fascinating is they're having these huge personality clashes in the organization. And when I did the personality assessments with them, they were able to see why they were having these clashes. They were like, oh my goodness, that is typical ISTJ behavior. And this ISTJ is clashing with this ENTP. And so basically they're coming from a different value system, so they're not able to actually come together. And they were like, we should have done this years ago. It could have really avoided us so much conflict. I mean, they were near a lawsuit. This guy that I was working with last week had taken his case to the lawyers and he was going to sue the company. And now, literally in the space of a few days that I've been working with him, he's just like, I'm just going to quit. It's not even worth it. Because I was able to also show him how his personality reacts in a specific way when he feels betrayed or when he feels like people aren't being loyal to him. So for me, it's a question of, if you're a startup, how do you from the beginning start to use these tools, these soft tools that are widely available in the market? And if you get a good consultant or a good practitioner, you can really get some of this guesswork out of the way. So that was my first thought around this particular issue of hiring friends versus family, but also courageous conversations, as was raised, and this idea of conflict and families, etc. Any thoughts?
Just to support your point, Rachel, an interesting perspective is, maybe this is biased towards tech companies, but a lot of the most successful tech companies, if you look at what the CEO and COO are doing, is in the early days, they spend up to 50% of their time just hiring, building culture, and doing people work. 50% of their time. I think the perception is that in the early days of a startup, you're working mainly on product, especially once you figure out what the product is, you're still just working on product, which is actually not the case for a lot of the most successful startups.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, just a question there, sorry, Rachel, is, so how does one balance this? So obviously now in my own venture, we're trying to approach this. This is almost the base that we're starting at, is how well do we know each other? And what I'm fearing is that the balance starts tipping too much towards relationship focus, and that the urgency of that problem starts to, you know, we can work well together and we can enjoy each other and we can keep changing our strategy based on, you know, who we are as people. And I just worry a bit that the urgency of the problem that needs to be solved can get lost in all of that good feelings about working together and working well together and doing some things together, but not doing the thing that you really need to do together. How would you recommend kind of balancing that? I guess that speaks to those mom and pop type, you know, businesses as well, where you're really just looking after each other's interests more than you're actually going ahead. And is that a bad thing? You know, is there any danger in that?
So I mean, I will emphasize what Khotso said. I think it's a 50-50. I think you have to spend equal time. So if you find yourself becoming too soft and mushy, it means that you've lost the balance. And I think, you know, part of being a business is always being reflective, right? So are we overdoing this people stuff to a point where it's debilitating us? So you have to make sure, firstly, that you're spending equal amounts of time. And that can be as easy as thinking about it in terms of hours, right? So we've spent the last week just talking about the strategy. Do we want to spend an equal amount of time talking about our team and what it looks like at the moment? What are our personalities? How do we communicate? What is our style of communicating? What is a conflict trigger for each person in the team? So you know, the model I like to use is the very typical forming, storming, norming, right? So you want to put your soft stuff into that and kind of say, okay, so if I'm using, let's say, MBTI as a tool, how am I thinking about the forming piece? So we've got 5 different people in the startup. They all have different personality. What does that mean for the way we form? What does each person need to be successful? And very quickly, you'll start to notice that it actually speaks to your strategy as well. So you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So if I give you an example, if you have somebody who is an ENTP in your team, ENTPs are what we call innovative explorers. So they like to create new things, but it needs to be exciting. There needs to be adrenaline, and they're not very good at staying with one thing, right? They want many exciting bits. And so immediately you know that the way to stimulate them is to perhaps give them the research piece, because they can go out and talk to people, because their extroverted side loves to meet people. So you give them the work that says, you go meet the market, you go find out what people want. They will love that. But imagine you give that to the person who you say, for example, this person is dependable because they always hand in things on time. But the thing is, that person may not be the personality that enjoys actually the chaos of going into a market and seeking out information. And so that mismatch already starts to affect the strategy of your organization. So I often say to people, if you're pegging your soft stuff against or within the strategy of the organization, you start to get results much quicker. So the two are actually mutually inclusive. They work together. It's the same thing if you start, I've started from the soft end. If you start from the strategy end and you sort of say, you know, we're trying to go into the market and figure out a certain thing, it's then figuring out, well, who's stimulated by this? And that's just by asking the question. Most of the time we don't ask the question, we delegate. You know, we say, I'm the leader, so I think this person should be doing this, or based on my observations, this person should be doing this, instead of just asking, like, who does this stimulate and why does it stimulate? Make the case for it, and then give them the work to do. So that would be my suggestion. I don't know if anyone else has something to add. Adila, does that help you?
No, very much so. Very, very much so. I think the biggest takeaway there is to align with the strategy rather than to separate and say, okay, now we're dealing with this, and now and then the other day we're doing something else. They're working hand in hand at all times.
Absolutely.
I really like the use of the tools so early on in the forming of the partnerships. I've used what's this called? Strengths Finder. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes.
Yes. Looking back at some of my experiences, like one conclusion I've come to is that you need to date your business partners in the same way that you don't go into a marriage. I didn't start dating. I didn't just decide I'm gonna be with my boyfriend for like 5 years. There was a whole process, and you're so meticulous, and this is something you've thought about. You think about like, what do you want in a person? But this same thought process is equally as important for someone you're going to place your livelihood, your, you know, income and your entire, like 80% of your time that you will spend in your life, you're going to be doing this with this person if you start a business with them and you do it full time. But that same process that you do for a romantic relationship doesn't exist at all for this business partner. It's like just as equally important, you know. Yeah, it's just struck me when I thought about it. I'm like, this business partner of mine is actually no different to my romantic partner. Yet I've spent so much time introspecting about who I am, what does it mean about the kind of guy I need to be with, and what does he need to have. And I didn't do any of this. I just like, oh, friend, this is such a nice idea. Let's start a business. Let's just do it together. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, another thing I'll throw in there as well that I say to both startups and to organizations that have been around a long time is, I think one of the worst things, particularly in our culture, in African culture, and I'm generalizing because of course African culture is so diverse, but I find in the various countries I've worked in, this is the case. People are very afraid of conflict, right? There's this sense that if we have any tension between us, it's a bad thing. And so we don't have any tools to recover from that quickly. First of all, because culturally we're like, oh, this is a terrible thing, and now we're in a bad space, and now what we do about it, so it becomes awkward. And that awkwardness builds into years and years or months and months of resentment and months of not communicating honestly and vulnerably. And you know, right at the beginning of your business, you're extremely fragile. It's so important that you be honest with each other. You know, we're not delivering at the level that we should be. Our quality of product isn't great, because you're going to get somebody who's going to slack. You're going to get somebody who's not delivering at the level that they should, performing at the peak. And you need to be able to have that conversation as quickly as possible. And so learning how to have courageous conversations is number one. So learning the framework of courageous conversations. How do you give someone feedback so that they don't feel defensive? And then number two, understanding that conflict is actually important for your organization. Conflict is what, those tension points are what make the organization great. That's what moves it from good to great, is organizations who are able to use a tension point to learn something from it, grow much faster. And if you're a person who follows biomimicry, for example, we know from nature that the most beautiful things in nature are actually formed out of conflict. So if you think of mountains, they come from, you know, plates coming together and creating these mountains. If you think of pearls that are created from a foreign object getting into an oyster and irritating it, and then it releases this nacre liquid and creates, you know, creates a shell around this object and creates a pearl over time. I mean, nature teaches us that conflict is good, but human sciences, or I don't know, human interactions tell us that it's the worst thing that could happen. And so I find 8 out of 10 times that I'm called in to train an organization in leadership, it's about conflict. And it's because right from the onset, people have just never been taught how to deal with conflict. And that actually conflict is a fantastic thing. It exists for the enrichment of your organization. So I would think about that as well. Any thoughts?
No, really, really valuable insights.
Okay, good. So how do I share a page? I actually wanted to show this conflict curve page. What do I do?
So is it on PowerPoint? Is it something that you drew?
It's on PowerPoint.
Oh, sure. You can email it to me, and I'll just quickly send it to my Alan Gray email. Then I'll just pull it up and share my screen.
Oh, okay. Okay, let me do that.
So in fact, I could actually just make you the presenter, and then you can share your screen now.
Okay, great. And then take it back to you immediately, because you know I'm not tech savvy like that.
See, I'm just trying to figure. Oh, let's see. Change presenter. You are now the presenter.
Okay, so show my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
So can you see this that I've just opened?
Yep.
The conflict curve?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to show that because I think it's so important in terms of understanding that not everything. The problem is we conflate conflicts with crisis. So we've had a conflict in the organization, and we think it's a crisis, but really it could be any of those four things before a crisis happens, right? And so understanding which level you're at also gives you the wisdom as to what kind of intervention to bring in. And the only point at which you need to bring in an external person is when you're having a crisis. But everywhere along this curve, you've got the tools to actually have a conversation and move on really, really quickly. And it's usually an early expression of feelings and values that allows people to move on, which is, again, stuff we don't usually teach in our MBA. So I just wanted to show you that just as something you could think about for the next time, which will probably be very soon, when you have a tension point or a misunderstanding or something between you and the person you're working with. Okay, Jose, you can take it back. Cool. Great. I think we've thrashed that topic quite nicely. I mean, would you agree? Should we move on to the next one?
Great.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's do it. So let's go to, so that was Khotso's one. Let's go to this idea of responsible entrepreneurship, which I think is a really important topic for the continent, for Africa. Was it Adila? It was you that was, no, it was this Larato's point? Did I have this correct?
This was Adila.
It was Adila, sorry. Adila, can you please just say a little bit more? I know you'd already said quite a bit before, but say what you would like to get an answer to in terms of this, and then we can thrash it out.
So I guess the challenge that I always face is, as I mentioned, that as with many things in life, it's not just applicable to business. You're very comfortable with the way things are until someone highlights something to you, and then you kind of realize that, whoa, hold on, actually, I've actually really just not been thinking critically about this and applying my ethics to it and just accepting it as the way things are. So the challenge for me is always trying to, I mean, I suppose, thankfully, I'm in spaces where we're always talking about these kinds of topics. So maybe at this phase, I'm realizing a lot of those things that I think are borderline unethical. But the challenge is then to really just continue operating, and not be crippled by sort of economic injustices that you see, and sort of finding a balance between, the way things are and the way things just have always been and probably will be for a while, versus being insistent on changing, and the examples, one of the examples I used is industry collaboration versus collusion. That's one, like I said, it's new to me, and it really, really confuses me at times, that sometimes I feel like market control by, the key sort of top few competitors really just seems a little bit too close, and a little bit, the communication seems a bit too much to be a healthy competition. And then the other one that really bothers me is BEE and the application thereof, and the way that it's sort of spoken about in business and really criticized. But at the same time, the values behind it are not really being applied in any way. So, it's almost like this criticism of the system, but then no move towards trying to solve those same issues. So yeah, those are two, and we don't have to speak to the examples. I think the issue to me is just more the whole, where do you draw the line in terms of, making changes and being insistent on that, and where do you kind of stop and say, this is the business I operate under, And you know, sorry, I'm going on for a while now, but it's difficult when you're an entrepreneur as well, and you know you cash flow is your thing, and you know you've got to make sure you often can lean back on that kind of, well, I'm just trying to survive day to day and create jobs and feel comfortable in that space without actually raising the fact that, hold on, there's no diversity in my team, or this deal makes absolutely no sense, or you know, it's things that are a little bit softer.
I just wanted to add a question as well. So, just number one, I don't believe that it's possible to teach ethics, mainly because I don't believe in intrinsic good or evil. In fact, I think that the definition of ethics is more appropriate if we use a definition that fits well with game theory as opposed to intrinsic morality. And I think whenever people discuss ethics, what it actually means is, again, something that conforms more to game theory. What is it that we agree based on who has the most influence and power in that situation? So then my question is, why on earth do we spend time teaching ethics? I know it's a bit of a crazy question, and maybe just tying it back again is whenever we do teach ethics. So for example, at university, there we were discussing ethics, but we didn't discuss sexism and slavery, but we're discussing how to operate a listed company on the JSE, those types of issues.
Geez, you guys are asking some really deep questions. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts? I guess the question that comes to mind for me is, I think to the point that Khotso, that you were making is, first of all, I think, is there such a thing as an honest business? I often hear this, that anybody who's ever made $1 million cannot have done it honestly. I've heard people say this in the context of how the world operates and the kinds of games you need to play to make money. I think that's one thing that comes to mind for me. The other thing on ethics is it's situational. So if you operate, for example, in a country like Zimbabwe, which is where I am, where the government is inherently and exponentially corrupt, and where if you engage, you can almost be punished for ethical business practice. So what do I mean? I have friends, for example, who are millionaires in their entrepreneurial ventures. They're doing extremely well. They would love to contribute to the country's economy, but they almost go underground because if they actually are visible, and we talked about this last week when we talked about visibility in Africa, the government is going to come after them hard, and they're likely going to lose their business, and they're likely going to be overtaxed because, of course, there's tax, and then there's the tax where someone just knocks on your door and says, you need to give us money now. And so in that moment, ethics becomes a very precarious space. And this happens across Africa, where it's kind of like, what does ethics mean in a context that isn't ethical inherently? What does that actually mean? And I think it's a big question. I think this question we all have to answer together, because I think, to Khotso's point, it's not a textbook conversation, it's an experiential one. It's, what do you do in that moment? In that real moment when you're faced with a real dilemma that you never actually imagined you would face in your business. Like, this happens in Zimbabwe a lot, this happens in Nigeria a lot, where, and I think it happens in South Africa too. I think this is what this whole Gupta conversation is about, right? And the state capture, where somebody comes up to you and says, I could make you really successful, and this is how that's going to happen. And you're also seeing at the same time how your business could make a difference in society. And then this person is saying, I'm going to give you a helping hand. What do you do? I mean, what would you do in that situation?
And hence I say, what I would do is just manage my risk. I do have a personal value system. I just don't think it's necessarily ethical because I don't know how it might impact somebody else negatively. So it's a value system, but it could potentially be harmful to somebody else. The second thing I'll do is manage my risk. I think that's what most people do. Because once again, we spoke about this being deeply contextual and in the moment and experiential. So I wouldn't necessarily do this at this stage, but you know, a couple of 100 years ago, it was quite normal to go and get startup funding from your government, get a ship and then get slaves. And then fast forward to a couple of 100 years later, you're Nike and you can't have a factory with workers working under those conditions. So it was just risky for Nike to do that today, but 400 years ago it was okay. So it's really about risk management, I think, and having your own personal value system.
Interesting. You know, I remember when I was... Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, just a interesting example of an entrepreneur. I don't know if anyone knows Swadi. I'm not sure of her surname, but she's got the really lovely... That's it, yeah. And she's got the luxury tea and tea houses and luxury brand. She's really incredible. But she's someone who basically showed me how ethics, your own ethics and your value system can be at the heart and soul of the way that you grow. And what it came down to is, you know, I listened to a talk of hers where she painted this picture of, you know, there'll never be a night shift in her factory because that just makes no sense. People need sleep. And they need to see their families. Every school holiday is a shutdown period. And at some point, we just asked the question, but who on earth wants to invest in this business that puts happiness and, you know, balance before profits? And she said, no one. She's entirely self-funded and her growth will be slow. And she will have limits to her growth. And to me, that kind of really all just ties in. And I think if you're aiming to be the $1 million business and make the million, you know, you're going to compromise. So I don't know if it's a very new kind of thought that I'm entertaining, is that ambition is not the ambition, and big growth and massive disruptive change doesn't always have to be the end game. You know, if you're injecting the value system that you hold dear into your business is what you want, then that can be enough. But then it's that internal conflict of my ego and what I want. And, you know, so I don't know. I just think she's an amazing example of that.
Absolutely. Tom, do you have any thoughts?
It's wonderful there.
Hey, sorry, I'm still here. Yeah, I recently listened to a BBC documentary where they were talking about UN food aid to parts of Africa where there was previously civil war, and it was really interesting because you get a whole lot of designated refugee camps that are set up by people in the community, and then they kind of act as mob bosses, basically receiving the aid and then keeping some of it for themselves and then trading it, and basically starting a little business of their own. And there were people that were keeping a little bit for themselves but overall helping, and there were people who are taking like 50% of it. But the response from the UN was they just did not acknowledge that this was happening at all. And these people were questioning them, saying, you know, if you could at least acknowledge that this is happening, and maybe even work with these people somehow, you could do greater good. But they kind of their ethical stance kind of got in the way, because they said, if this is happening, then, you know, this we're admitting that our system isn't perfect, and we're admitting that we're in collusion with these people. So I just thought that was an interesting example.
That's a fantastic example. You know, it's interesting. When I was studying anthropology, we had this big debate about a case study of a farm, well, several farms actually in Cape Town, that, well, firstly, if you remember, there were a lot of farms that would pay off workers with alcohol, and that has been historical. But also there was the case of, you know, children who were working on these farms, similar to, I suppose, sweatshops, etc. And there was this whole law. I can't remember the specifics of it, but there was a law that was passed that essentially said these children should not be working because they're too young and it's child labor. Except that over the years, they then noticed that the families got very impoverished because these children could no longer work. And so the question became, should this law have been passed? Because now families are starving because we are protecting children who decides whether children can work or not, because some people grew up working all their lives in their rural village, and what does that really mean? And I think for me, and I want to go back to this point of values because I think it's so important. I think that the problems with business start when we start from a law or ethics position. I think that change across the world and with businesses happens when people start from a values perspective. I think that, if you look at Bill George's work, for example, the book True North, where he basically does a case study of all these leaders across the world who've built businesses based on their values. So he has a powerful example of Novartis, where the CEO, Daniel, I forget his last name, but Daniel, when he became the CEO of Novartis, took from his life experience where he had been very sickly, and all of Novartis is a healthcare, like pharmaceutical company, right? So they create all these products for the health space. And Daniel Vasselli, that's his last name, Daniel had grown up in Europe somewhere, and he had been very sickly as a child, and there was a year in which he spent in hospital because he had some infection or virus or something of that nature, and his parents couldn't come and visit him because the hospital he was in was too far from where he lived. So no one visited him. He was a child. The nurses treated him really badly, and he had never forgotten that experience. So when he became CEO of Novartis, he made the culture of the organization to be one of care for the patient. So we must always put the patient in the forefront. And he was basing that on his own personal values, because he knew what it was like to be ill-treated as a patient. So for example, one of the things he was passionate about is those incontinency bags. They were notorious for bursting in public, and patients would be embarrassed because now your urine or your poop is all over the place. And he was like, that must never happen to a patient. And so drove so that the quality of those products could be improved. And of course, what happened is the profits of Novartis weren't what they were when they were being a typical healthcare company, which are notorious for making shortcuts all over the place. But he walked away from that saying the intention was to be a values-driven leader, and we still made money. We didn't make as much as we were making, but we made lots, tons, millions, of dollars. And I think that for those of us who are starting off as entrepreneurs, the question of values is so important. Figure out what your values are based on your own life story, where you have come from, what you have learned along the way, because not only does that make you a convicted type of, a conviction type of entrepreneur, but also it makes the model sustainable because you're being driven from something that comes internally from you. Now, does that make you the world's biggest billionaire? Possibly. I think Oprah is a great case study of that. She moved away from the typical television, let's sell scandals and sensationalism, and she sort of created television that really speaks to people's hearts and values, and she's a billionaire because of it. So
yeah, I think the issue though with this is that there's an underlying assumption that those values are good, and that's where maybe the ethics becomes problematic, is that the ethics almost comes in to say there are some values that are better than others. There is a ranking of what you should be valuing. You should be wanting to care for your patient. But maybe there is some guy out there who doesn't give a damn about the patients, and his value is that he wants to just extract as much monetary rewards out of the venture, and that's what is driving that person. and the ethics comes in to argue that, well, in cases where that's the case, there is a lot of harm. I mean, there's been a lot of harm done to society when that's been the driver of business. So then if we know that there's been a lot of harm and we're coming in, which then maybe means that my values do no harm first, whatever you do, at the very least do no harm, and that's from a very research perspective. But if you're going to come in to intervene in any space or context for society, at the very least do no harm. But then we know that there has been harm done because of certain things being valued by business owners. So should we then be at least teaching, or if you're going to bring this into an education space, should there be a move to teach people to avoid doing that harm that we have quite clear evidence was caused? And that's always been the tricky thing. I found it very difficult. Is that, and maybe sometimes it makes you not want to move because you're like, yeah, there's so much good I want to do, but I've worked in the evaluation space where people come in the NGO space as well. They want to end poverty. They bring all sorts of interventions, which on paper look great, till you go in as an evaluator and you gather data and you look at the results and you realize, oh, that tap that you put in that neighborhood to try and help people, all these women stop walking, has actually raised abusive domestic violence, because actually that walk to the faraway well was an escape or whatever, and it was a support. This is actually from an actual study that was done, that there was an intention to try and help or do good, and on paper it looks great. It's the values underlying that are great, but it did cause harm in the end. Yeah, and just also, where do I invest my time? You try and find organizations that align with you value-wise, but they operate within a capitalist system, and they operate within this historic system that we work in. So you can't. And it was at this Danish company I worked for. They always said when we go into African markets, we have to pay facilitation fees. That's what it's called, instead of bribes. And I was like, this is how the West tricks everyone. They're like, no, we need to fix all the corruption in Africa. It's only corruption when it's Africa. When it's Denmark, it's facilitation fees and not bribes. And it's so tricky, because you're like, I'm sitting there like, we're about to do this, so you're not comfortable, but at the same time, is it a right decision to then leave the job based on that, when you are maybe you're taking care of your entire family with that salary? And it's like, I think I've just learned that the world is very complex, and there is no black and white. A lot of things are just gray, and yeah, I guess then you just need to figure out how you navigate it. And going back to your personal values probably actually helps when you make those tough decisions. But yeah.
Also, maybe just one other element is, besides your personal values, but what about the values of the people that you serve? So sometimes there can be a bit of a tension there. And a quick example is, there's that student who comes from the township or rural South Africa. You want to help them. So you decide to give them money, then you decide what they should study, where they should work. And I was that student, and I hated that system. And I actually preferred working for someone who was much more, for example, profit-driven, but had aligned incentives. And I found that when I solved for aligned incentives, my needs were more likely to be met than going for someone who wants to be is a kind or altruistic, but the incentives are just misaligned because they've got their value system and they don't necessarily care about me. And they just want to save me.
So here's my question, Khotso, and also Lerato. I mean, isn't this where conversation comes in? So I don't assume that values exist in a vacuum, because certainly my good may look similar to someone else's good, but with a nuance, right? And so isn't where collaboration comes in? So if we are forming a team, I, Rachel, the founder, have values, but what are the values of the people I'm working with, which is to Adila's example of Swati, who is quite a close friend of mine, so I know her model quite well, right? And Adila, you're so right. I mean, and part of how she's done that as well is to align to the values of the people, right? So for example, one of the reasons why she finishes work at 4:30 is because her people come from, a lot of the factory people come from townships. So she wants to make sure they get home when it's still light, so they don't, you know, crime and all sorts of things. So she's being thoughtful and collaborative about how her values, and she grew up in the Western world, she grew up largely in France and in the US. So, you know, she's got this value of work ethic and this is how the world works, blah, blah, blah. But she's like, but, you know, I can also meet you at your value, value threshold, which is, for example, family in an African context, and, you know, how do we communicate, even gender. She thinks of all of those things. So wouldn't you say that we can solve for that if we were better at communicating and collaborating?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, Rachel. I feel like that's always the thing that's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely on a, sorry, I didn't know you say something.
No, Loretta, go for it.
On a team, in your internal team and in the company that you work for, or you are building with someone else, that's definitely a very good solution. I think it just becomes tricky where you feel like you are having to make, there's an external, I guess then yeah, the conversations, we actually have this at work where we working in the public sector, sometimes we do get asked for a bribe when we're putting in a proposal or whatever, and then as a firm, with the values having aligned amongst the people who work for the firm, it's easy to make that decision to say, no, we're not going to go for this because it's against what we want to do. And yeah, and it is, I guess, tough choices, and staying true to what you believe in and trusting that you'll be able to deal with whatever impact that comes from that.
Yeah. You know, and I also think that the question of doing harm to someone else isn't as complicated as we've made it. I think we're so out of tune with each other as people that it's become more complex than it needs to be. At least that's my very simple assessment. So let me give an example. Just yesterday, I was watching the documentary that's currently on DSTV, Becoming Warren Buffett. And it's fascinating because this is the man who's given the most amount of money to philanthropy. Right, I think to date he's given $36 billion, the biggest ever in the history of the world, as far as we know. And yet, you know, there were things in his life that I thought, those are interesting things that I think society might frown at a little bit. So I discovered, for example, he was polyamorous. I didn't know this. So for those of you who don't know what polyamorous means, he had two lovers. He had two wives, essentially. One lived in France, San Francisco. And, yeah, I didn't know this. Yeah, it was. I was like, wow, Warren Buffett, you're like all modern and everything. You know, some of the businesses that he has money in, I was just like, you know, some of them are killing us with their sugar. You know, like. But this is the thing is though, I mean, firstly, can you really appease everybody's sense of values? Because for every human being in the world, there is a different set of values. There's nuance. But also secondly, I feel like I wouldn't then, you know, when Warren Buffett has, when he dies and people are talking about him, I don't think that even though he's invested in a few companies that, I mean, for example, Salomon Brothers was one of the companies that he then became chair of, and at some point they got involved in a scandal because they were basically trading stocks that didn't exist, at blah, 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 blah. But does that make him a bad human being? You know, the water is always murky somewhere, somehow. I think it gets there for all of us. But I do think that what he has that I found interesting is he maintains a consciousness about other human beings. And I think accepted he could never do that perfect, because one of the things he kept saying is, I understand numbers really well, but I don't understand people very well. He's very much a nerd, Warren Buffett, and apparently his social, I mean, both of his wives were like, his social intelligence is almost non-existent. But he surrounded himself with people who can help him. And he found a way to sort of read the nuance. But he was like, I'll never ever be good at that stuff. But yet here's a guy who's done so much good in the world. So what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is, I think let's be careful also to not overly moralize the conversation to the point of paralysis. I think at some point you just have to say, you know, does this look like I'm doing harm? And I don't think that's difficult to tell. We don't, if you dodge the question, it becomes difficult to tell. You know, so for example, those workers, I mean, those farms in Cape Town could have, they were moralizing it by saying that these children are bringing money to their families. But if they paid their parents more money, these kids could go to school. It's a very simple question. I don't think it was as complicated as they were making it out to be. But, you know, they were solving for the bottom line and not for the human being, right? So I think if you balance out that bottom line human being conversation, you'll come out in a much, much, much better place.
Yeah, and I think it actually, what I'm hearing is also that there's this age, you need to also, you bring in people's agency. If you're consistently aware of the fact that human beings all have agency, and if you're not going into situations making decisions on behalf of others, and this is, I mean, it's in vogue now with design thinking and human-centered research, etc. It's trying to get to the root of that don't go into problem trying to solve them without ever even interacting with the person whose problem you're trying to solve. Right. And recognizing their agency in that context, that they are fully human like you are, and have whatever their own set of values and beliefs and understanding of what problem it is that they're facing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's a good bit of.
Absolutely.
But I like this paralysis thing, because I feel like sometimes I struggle from, I'm like, oh, now you're thinking of all the 500 ways in which this could hurt somebody, and then you end up not acting. Where had you acted, because the scholarship thing that the example Khotso was giving is that yes, your agency in that example was neglected. So that person didn't consider in giving you the money, and there was never a conversation about, Khotso, what do you want to study? What do you want to do at university? It was, I'm going to give you money on condition that you study this A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But even if they've done that, in those contexts, maybe that person, without this opportunity, wouldn't have gone to university at all. And you don't know if that was enough of a reason to take the conditions, if given those two options, like go to university or go under these hectic conditions. Like, you don't know, you also don't know what good you might do. Just as much as you don't know what harm can come of it, you also don't know what the person receiving it, what good they could take out of it. So the paralysis, you need to not think yourself into not acting at all. Which is, yeah, I struggle a bit with that.
Yeah, well, that was yet another good conversation. This is fantastic. We've got 40 minutes left. Am I right, Khotso? We end at 8:30, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the time goes quickly. So maybe let's give each of the next questions just 10 minutes. So I'll time it so that we can get through all of them, because we've answered actually we've actually answered all of mine from the conversations we've had. So we've got a few more left, like 4 more. So there was a question on, Adila, can we skip the application of BEE and come back to it so we can jump maybe to Lerato's one, which is, yeah, so innovation moves society in a different direction. So it shouldn't just be innovation for innovation's sake, actually make a difference in society. Lerato, do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so that was more, it was so a good example is particularly like businesses or my travel around the continent, observing how mostly South African businesses just do a copy paste. It's literally copy paste. You walk into a mall in Ghana, and if someone had just dropped you there, and not told you where they put you, you wouldn't know that you've lived in South Africa. You wouldn't actually, it's actually the same floor plan that they used somewhere in. And it often so, to some extent, it's laziness in the sense it hasn't taken the time to understand that local context, to really figure out how could we move this society beyond what they even imagined, and really take into account what these people here really need or want, or what problems they're facing, instead of this whatever is inside. Because South Africans are very arrogant, and South African businesses are very arrogant, and even the ones that have failed were the most arrogant. They failed to succeed in other markets on the continent. It's because they're just like, there's an aspirational view towards the continent, towards South Africa. So everyone, of course, wants everything that we have here. So there's this copy paste. I don't know, and I mean, in some cases, yeah. So if something having worked somewhere else, we should be learning from each other. If something worked somewhere else and has the potential to work here, sure, we should be doing that. But that challenge of really pushing ourselves to reimagine our societies and build solutions that move us forward. But yeah, was just the thought.
It's a great thought. Let's take a few minutes to discuss that. What do other people think?
I don't know. I think just one challenge is when we look at the type of ideas and businesses coming out of different parts of Africa, especially when we talk about SMEs, not just big companies, we sort of forget that different parts of the world, actually the exact same thing happens, just that they've had a much longer development trajectory, and our situation is the opposite, where we've had colonialism and just conflicts, etc. Whereas places like Europe had even more conflicts than Africa, which we tend to forget. In fact, they had bigger scale conflicts, but they've had just a much longer development trajectory. So I think that's going to change in the next coming decades, and some of it is already changing now when we look at different parts of Africa and what types of businesses are popping up.
Okay. Anyone else? So for me, I mean, my quick thought on that one is, for me, I think that the trouble I find in Africa in interacting across the board really is that we're not really taught the skill of imagination, of thinking. So, I mean, if there's two things I would suggest you look at, there's a book by Edward de Bono called The Six Thinking Hats. And he makes such a great argument, which is that the problem with our education systems almost across the board, except in the countries that have gotten innovation right, is that we've been taught to argue. Okay, so we've been taught because of the Aristotelian, the Socrates, and the Plato models to basically argue and not hear each other out, right? So it's always a debate about who's right. And in that idea of who's right, we almost seek to outdo each other, which is why we then replicate these same models of the same thing, instead of taking our thinking to the next level, again, via collaboration. So he developed this methodology that basically allows people to think better, because he says thinking is actually an art. It's something you should be taught. So just because, for example, you have a very high IQ, it basically means you have the engine, but you don't really have the capacity to drive necessarily. And thinking is like the driver. You have to be taught to do that. And that's one book I would suggest every entrepreneur reads, that every person reads actually, because it helps you to really think through problems. Because what I find is I think in Africa, we are very short on imagination. We don't give ourselves permission to imagine wildly and say, if I was just to create something really incredible, and to the point of solving, I think this also, we can get to the question of solving society's issues, so the problem, not the product. I think that there's the issue of the dependency on government as the problem solvers also doesn't allow us to take on responsibility to say, actually, it's my responsibility to be imaginative enough to fix these problems. So there's an incredible Nigerian, his name is Afosa Ojomo. He's a researcher at Harvard, and he studies poverty. When his TED talk comes out, I will post it on our online academy thing. But basically, the argument he makes is, he starts off with the history of the car, and he says, a lot of the time people forget that the car was created before roads even existed, right? So the imagination came before the development. There was this wild and crazy person who was like, I want to basically see people move faster and not have to use horse carriages all the time. But there were no roads, but he still built the car. And I think that's imagination. That's a person who goes beyond what they're seeing in the present and says, so what, I can create this thing. So for example, you know, it's Fred Swaneker waking up and saying, I am going to create the Ivy Leagues of Africa, except my Ivy Leagues are going to be even better than the Ivy Leagues, because I'm going to get the best of all the Ivy Leagues, the best of all African universities, and create some sort of a mishmash of all of those things. And that's a person who's imagining. And I think our problem is, perhaps because of poverty, we are too practical. Perhaps because of suffering, we are too sort of in the, you know, in spiral dynamics, what you call being sort of right at the bottom of survivalism. And I think if we could be taught to unlock the imagination, and I've always said to people that I coach, believe in your madness. If you've got a crazy thought that isn't about killing other people or harming them, and it's about society forward, believe it, because everybody who's going to hear is going to say you're crazy. But and all the innovation we admire in the world was people who were crazy and who did it. And I think for me, that's the missing ingredient in Africa, is if we just were taught to imagine. And De Bono's first 6 Hats is a great place to start, to just imagine all sorts of crazy ideas, especially under the green hat. I think we could innovate to move society forward, and I think we could actually solve problems, like real problems.
So good.
I also think it starts at home. So, I mean, different cultures and ethnicities operate very differently, but certainly within some Bantu tribes, just try coming up with crazy ideas at home and see how your parents will treat you.
Exactly. Like you're crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the powerful things that Afosa says as well is that to change society, you have to, so his argument basically was, and this is what he's doing research at Harvard for, and a book is going to come out on this soon. His title was essentially The Poverty Paradox, Why Focusing on Poverty Makes Us Poorer, or something of that nature. But basically he was saying, you know, it's that universal theory that what you focus on expands, right? What you look at keeps growing. And so for us to be able to innovate, we have to not focus on the poverty issue. We have to focus on the possibility of richness. Because if we keep thinking of our market as poor people, for example, we're never going to create the products that elevate them. We're always going to give them the stuff that they can afford, if that makes sense. Instead of about how do we actually take these people to the next level. So, you know, let me give my example of leadership development. What I've noticed in Africa with leadership development is we get the cheapest tools. That's what we get. If you get at someone coming to do leadership for you, coming from somewhere in the world, likely they're bringing you the cheapest version of it. What I do with my clients is I say to them, I'm going to bring you a world-class version of this. And I'm going to have to work with you to see how we can afford it and make it happen, because the material is expensive. I could have, as an entrepreneur, said the quickest way to make a buck is just give them the cheapest version and just get my money and go. But I was just like, why should I treat you like poor Africans? I want to take you to the next level of leadership and thinking. So I'm not going to treat you like you're poor, because a client will often say to me, but we don't have that money. I'm like, no, you do. You're going to, let me tell you the 100 things you're going to spend it on. And I can tell you that you should spend it on me and what I'm going to give you, because it's going to change your dynamic. And once you've proven that to them, they become a market. They start to buy. And I think Afosa's argument was exactly that. The guy who thought about the car wasn't thinking people are too poor because they're all driving horses. And in fact, it's actually people, everybody else drives. He took people to the next level. He imagined them being completely different. And I think our problem, especially in Protest Africa, which is my most unpopular message, in Protest Africa, we are preserving poverty. We keep focusing on the poverty issues. And therefore, we never move. We just keep making the problem bigger and bigger. It expands because that's where all our attention is going. So I would really challenge you as an entrepreneur to dare yourself to say, if I wasn't thinking of poverty and I was thinking of the possibility of elevating my people's dignity, of elevating their experience of the world, what would I create? Because that will change your product completely. And that's what Swati did. Swati started from, I'm tired of Africans always making beads. Like, who cares for beads? I want to make a luxury tea. And people were like, are you crazy? Who's going to buy luxury tea in Africa? She's like, I don't care. All I know is I want to make a luxury tea. We are the biggest tea growers in the world. We don't have a luxury product.
She's so amazing.
Right? So I think the mindset shift needs to happen in that way. Any more points on this? Then we can move.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I just I think that goes back to the that recommendation that the top 80% of your profits should come from the top 20% of society's needs. But we'll get to that point later.
Well, let's get to that point. Let's go there, because that was actually going to be next. That was next on the list, so you can go.
Okay. Yeah, I guess when I read that, that was not my thinking. When they were talking about like you should, the kind of things that I've been thinking of that we need is things like transport, things like food, and just to. But how do you build a business that is going to, if your goal is to make people happier or to make people, I don't know, more confident, or these are, I think it's more difficult to think of a product or a service for these things rather than when I think it's easier to address the lower needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I just maybe some other people could just chime in about how do you build products or services for those higher needs.
Yeah.
Maybe just a quick thought on that one. I'm going to say something potentially unpopular. So I think in theory it makes sense to, like you said, 80% of your profits should come from the top 20% of society's needs. But I think that's us thinking about it deterministically, and I would prefer to think about this more stochastically, purely based on luck and probabilities. So you can't ever know for sure what the market will actually buy into and what these needs are, and hence an Instagram can come up and can be sold for $1 billion. People taking pictures of food and their cats, and it doesn't. The fact that it doesn't solve world hunger doesn't necessarily negate the fact that that service is valuable. And I think there's always a tension between, what should society be spending money on, and why do a lot of these interesting apps come up? And really, it is, once again, we should think about it stochastically. We actually don't know. Your goal is to build something that somebody wants, and to de-risk that process is the whole point of a startup.
Mm. And also, you don't know what will be valuable when.
Exactly.
The timing thing is also such a big one, because, yeah, I think I guess it's also being comfortable with uncertainty and just following whatever your current instinct or drive or desire is. And if there's a market for that or a need for that, because sometimes the need only emerges when the product is there. People didn't realize they needed this thing till it was actually physically available and tangible, and then it's getting used. So it's a very tricky one.
And I mean, and my question, Hotso, is I mean, who says Instagram won't solve world poverty or world hunger? I don't know that. So YouTube, for example, has educated millions of people in the world who would never enter a classroom. But that was not the intention initially. And yet YouTube actually is taking us closer to solving world hunger than any of these world hunger projects. It's getting people learning tools that they would never be able to learn, and therefore starting businesses and therefore innovating. Look at how Airbnb, I was watching a documentary about how Airbnb in Tanzania, for example, has gotten lots of young people into businesses that they would never have imagined. So who says Instagram won't solve world hunger? Sorry,
I need to unfortunately leave to go to a class. I'm going to try and log in from my phone. I'm going to log in from my phone when I get into the car.
Okay, great. It was good to have you, though, Lerato. Thank you for joining, in case we lose you.
I'm so excited. This is really awesome.
Great, great. And we've actually answered quite a few questions. Yeah, I think actually, I mean, Tom, did you feel like your question was adequately addressed? This 80-20 plus also problems, not products?
Yeah, thanks. That was really good points.
Okay. Well, that then leaves us with the obsession with competition versus monopoly, using the Google example, and then also the application of BE. I think those are our last points. So, shall we start with the application of BE quickly, since it applies to the South African context, which is where you guys all are?
Yeah, let's go for it.
I think your question was around how it can be applied in a much more sustainable and useful way, right? You want to expand a little bit on it?
Yeah. So, I mean, my criticism, and it's so easy to criticize when you're not the one in the driving seat, so take this with a pinch of salt. But my criticism is just on the same people who are sort of criticizing BE and how it uplifts a few and not the masses, and the same sort of arguments we've been hearing since the beginning are the ones who are sort of jump on the fronting bandwagon, the sort of cash flow kind of. So that's my recent sort of disappointment. And then deeply at my core, I see the value of diversity in every way, and see how it enriches teams. And I don't mean it just in a racial way. I mean it in gender. I mean it in viewpoints, in backgrounds, in whatever. And I'm just sort of very upset with the fact that that element of BE is just, if you look at BE as well as a system, it's designed very smartly, and no system will be perfect ever. But it brings in enterprise development and ownership, and speaks to ownership versus employment, and speaks to that impact of ownership versus the impact of just having a salary. So to me, it's like this great system that has its flaws for sure, but we are, in the context that I see it, it's being applied with varying sort of degrees. I guess I'm just more curious to hear other people's opinions on it than to try and solve anything.
Right. That's a great one. Thoughts, guys?
I think BE is a fantastic program. I think it was well designed. Every system at that kind of scale, will have problems naturally. I think where it fails, in fact, it's not even the fact that BE fails per se, but it's just that the government isn't necessarily pulling the most effective levers in creating societal change. So it's kind of weird to not actually tackle racism and sexism and the power dynamics and then create BE. So it would result in a lot of rent sinking and people gaming the system. So it's less about the fact that BE is an issue than it is about the government not pulling the biggest levers to create societal change. That's almost like yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Okay,
Just to
interesting.
add to that, Khoto, I generally agree with you. But to go back to Rachel's point about these, it's hard to legislate values, and uh, it's I've been part of conversations where people are saying, all you need to do is do this and this and this, and then you can go from a level 4 to a level 2, and it really is, it's frustrating because it's suddenly become it's like now how can you manage your tax effectively, or how can you do this, and it's not, I feel like it's not getting to the core of the problem. I think although it is doing a lot of good, I think it's probably better than not having a system there at all.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just jumping in. It's Dan. I've been in and out listening like a creepy person without contributing for the last little while. But the other session's now finished, so I'm here. I 100% agree with that. I don't think enough attention was paid up front to the heart of it was kind of paid to, let's get a system in place, but there wasn't work put into even explaining the importance, the spirit, the why it's beneficial. It was just kind of ticking the boxes that needed to be done. Yeah, and I think that was the biggest issue up front, and it's necessary to have the system in place, but it's just going to result in people gaming it, as has already been said.
And then there are some people who benefit, like myself. So it's not always BE fat cats. There's people like myself, an ordinary person, Khoto, who's benefited. But I think there's just that this kind of benefit doesn't reach enough people in society. But that's another issue. It's creating a very more black middle class.
Yeah, I think what I'm realizing now, and it speaks exactly to the disappointments that I had with this, is that the lack of values, but then the system that tries to impose the values. And I think that actually speaks a lot to what you were saying earlier, Rachel, about confronting values and discussing them. And I mean, what I was thinking about during that argument is that values and ethics and codes of living are very personal and very sensitive, and typically things that should, in a very old-fashioned way, stay out of the workplace and be what you, teach your kids, or and it's so ironic because the way 80% of your life is spent at work conducting business and making influence, and yes, your family influence is so important, but what you do and how you choose to make a livelihood actually has a massive impact. But I think in the context of BE, those conversations were lacking and are maybe coming up a lot more. And I mean, personally, I'm no longer shying away from calling things out very explicitly, and I guess calling myself out as well in terms of being in positions where you're able to hire people and realizing, that it sometimes will be very difficult to have that equity because the privileged have that, certain, it's easiest. It's easy because the structures that have propped them up have just made it so easy to step into the workplace. So I think a lot of it comes down to the dialogue around it, and that will really implement the change rather than and the internal transformation rather than the system that tries to put it there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the lost opportunity with BE is exactly what you've just said, Adila, which is the courageous conversations around how do we actually make this really work in real life. Because it's one thing to have the policy at hand. It's another for people to actually have the will to make it work. So to the point that Tom just made, I remember a really, really good friend of mine, one of my white friends in South Africa, incredible guy. I couldn't think of a better human being in the world, quite frankly. But he was saying to me, in his company, he solves for how can he get his status to 2 versus a 5 in the fastest way possible, right? So just get a young, articulate Black guy to be my CFO, and that already gives me lots of points. You know, and I think that I thought it was so unfortunate because that became a legislation conversation versus a values conversation. And I think often where I think the gap is and the opportunity lies, by the way, and none of the diversity experts have actually monopolized on this, is I think that there's just poor teaching on diversity. So I don't think anybody has actually made a good enough case about why diversity matters. The best book I've read so far, it's very mathematical, so it's difficult to get into if you don't have a mathematical mind, which I don't have, but it's a book called The Difference by Scott E. Page, How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Schools, and Societies. But he basically has been researching diversity from a purely mathematical basis, like what is the benefit of a diverse group of people versus, for example, just a cognitively smart group of people. And time again, if you put a group of diverse people in a room and a group of cognitively very smart people, what you find is that the diverse groups, time and time again, I think he actually says almost like 95% of the time, they problem solve better, they project into the future better, and they actually are much more collaborative. And so diversity, his basic statement is diversity trumps ability any day. And he gives this very famous example of how he discovered, I think it's penicillin or something, that the person who actually brought a group of people in the room, like really smart scientists, and nobody could figure it out. And the guy who figured it out was a farmer, like an uneducated farmer guy. I think it was penicillin. What has bovine in it? Is it penicillin? I can't remember. Anyway, I should remember this example better. But basically, there was this farmer who was in the room, had never been educated, but they had noticed that milkmaids were not getting these infections that other people were getting, and they're like, why is this happening? And they realized it was the lactose. And it was the farmer who brought this perspective in the room because, you know, he was a farmer and he was surrounded by lactose. And none of the scientists have been able to figure this out. And I think if you think about a richly diverse country like South Africa, the kinds of problems you could solve if you were leveraging the diversity of every single person in the room is incredible. But, you know, if you are, for example, at elite firms, the conversation becomes about merit versus, you know, race. And I think we have all these sophisticated conversations that actually miss the point of the value of diversity. And I think I blame the diversity practitioners for that. They actually just haven't brought in compelling arguments for why diversity really matters, and how it's actually stupid for you to not be diverse as a firm, right? I just think there hasn't been enough compelling education on it. And so people just don't buy it, right? Which is sad.
Yeah, agree. Completely agree.
So we have 9 more minutes. Adila, are you pleased with this BEE conversation?
Yeah, very much so. It's, I think that dialogue that I was talking about needing, I mean, having that just in this small space is
yeah,
important.
Yeah, I'm so glad. So competition versus monopoly in our last sort of 7 minutes before we wrap it up. Khotso, you were talking about Peter Thiel's idea of being overly focused on competition versus on creating monopolies. And is that a way to, what's his name? Oh my God, and I found him so boring, by the way, Clayton Christensen. He's the most boring professor on the planet. Sorry to say that. But he had this whole argument around, I mean, he talks about competitive response. That's his whole argument, which is that, you know, the startups have a competitive advantage because they can start really at the bottom, blah, 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 blah. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, so just 2 things, in fact 3 things, maybe just tying in, by the way, the diversity conversation is just when companies compete that fiercely, we have less diversity in ideas and products. When individuals compete that fiercely, as some of you might know, one of the biggest challenges I had with working at a company like McKinsey was the fierce competition. The competition was so fierce that we ended up competing on metrics that didn't matter, like what kind of person are you dating, which has nothing to do with your performance. So it can really be destructive. So I think, and obviously there's a healthy level of competition where we're continuously creating more good products for society. And then I think the flip side to that is like very little competition, which is monopolies. So at what point do we want monopolies to exist? And it's interesting. I do favor monopolies in certain instances where I always say if a monopoly can increase the GDP in my life, then, and obviously without doing bad, right? Increase the GDP in my life while doing good, then I like that monopoly. And so the contrast is Skype versus that disgusting, horrible yellow network. Skype increases the GDP in my life as a monopoly. They're not truly a monopoly yet. They're not like Google.
Right.
Google has increased the GDP by a lot, to the point that I use things like YouTube for my own education, which actually solved my hunger as an entrepreneur.
Right, absolutely.
And then you've got companies like this really big yellow telecommunications network that does that. Oh man, that really just does us in. Hey, so there's those types of questions. When does it make sense to have a monopoly, and at what level is competition healthy? Not just at a company level, but just even as individuals.
Good question. It's a great question.
Maybe just a very, very off-the-cuff answer. In my eyes, a monopoly, I feel like in a democracy, you're kind of forced into a monopoly from a public point of view in terms of the decisions that are being made. And I just feel like in the private sector where you have the opportunity for diversity in companies, I'm not seeing too much of a case for the monopoly at this point. I feel like there's a few things in life where you don't have much choice, like governments. Well, you have choice every few years, but then you've got to stick with that. Like spouses, since that seems to be a good example. You know, once you've made the decision, you kind of have to stick to it. But
unless
life,
you're Warren Buffett.
Unless you're Warren Buffett.
Right. Right. Yeah.
No, sure. I think my point is just I value choice, and I think in my sector, which is renewable energy, where the current flavor of the day is bringing down the Eskom monopoly and seeing the shady things that can happen, I'm very anti-monopoly at this point. So please debate.
10 points, debate. Yeah. I mean, okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
No, please go ahead, Kotso. Go ahead.
Well, so here's an interesting thought experiment, Adila, to help you answer your question. Would you rather have four networks who are really truly differentiated by the colors in their branding, or would you rather have a Skype that's scaled up and that really does increase your options in your life? So I think that's the key distinction between monopolies that do create value but can be a little bit destructive versus monopolies that create options for people. So what would you choose?
Okay, I think that's an interesting one, and of course, I mean, the answer is Skype. But the problem will be for me when Skype realizes the power and influence that it has and decides that actually we would like every Skype call to be on credit. And I think monopolies are great until the power that they come with is realized, and maybe not realized by, you know, generations later. I mean, Google, for example, was it's not a monopoly, I understand, but it's close to it, and it was such an amazing thing for so long until suddenly they realized the power in the data that they've got and the power in terms of the presence in people's lives that they have, and suddenly that power turns really scary. So Skype's great for now, but what are they doing with all of this great content that they've got? Maybe I'm just inherently doubting the ethics of people with power.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I feel like this. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go.
No, go.
I was just going to say, yeah, I was just going to say one more thing to add is I think that companies that aren't in a monopoly, their focus can be on differentiation rather than innovation. So, as an example, like Khotso said, our mobile providers, are they really offering a completely innovative product, or are they just trying to, market themselves as different to the competitor? It's the same with insurance and health insurance. Their products aren't that different, but it's all about the marketing. So I think that if your business is a monopoly where you don't have to think about the competition as much, your focus can be more on innovation.
Yeah. Mm.
I think this is it's a little bit, there are some parallels between this and the benevolent dictator thing. It's a benevolent dictator is better than democracy, but what are the chances of getting a benevolent dictator? That maybe a monopoly could be more efficient, but what are the chances they're not going to abuse that?
Telecom.
You know, it's interesting for me because I feel like this question, it's amazing that we ended here, brings us full circle, I think, to a number of the points that we discussed, because I think that the question of power can be tempered by values, right? And I think if organizations have the capacity to continually check in and say, at what point have we become a dictator and no longer benevolent? Perhaps there's an opportunity for us to see monopolies actually become collaborators in society versus something that we should be afraid of. I think that's number one. Number two, if I think of the idea of responsible entrepreneurship, which you were talking about earlier, I think what fascinates me, I watched a documentary some time ago that was talking about how competition is actually destroying the planet, because to the point that was just made now about differentiation versus innovation, you have 20 different companies doing exactly the same thing, and resources are being wasted while they're doing so, right? So they gave the example of ketchup. Like if you go into the average store in the United States, Walmart, I mean, they're like brands upon brands of ketchup. It's the same thing. Like you cannot innovate on ketchup any more than what it already is, except maybe adding more sugar, I don't know, adding more tomatoes, but it's all ketchup. And yet the amount of water that is being used to create this ketchup and, land that is being used to grow, I mean, there's a environmental responsibility question that comes, I think, with this idea of monopolies versus all these companies that are just free to play in the market. So I think, for me, I feel like this question takes us back to the question on values, right? On being responsible entrepreneurs sometimes requires for us to ask some really hard questions and to take our time answering them, because I think sometimes as well with the pressure of getting onto the Forbes 30 under 30 list quickly, we rush into these businesses and we really haven't thought through ultimately what is the impact that I'm having as an entrepreneur. So it is 8:31 and I'm trying to make sure that we stay true to time. I think we've had a fantastic conversation. This has been incredible for me, and I hope for you too. I think maybe to wrap up, let's just all give a final closing thought about, where our mind is at now compared to when we started, and then we can wrap it up.
So if no one else is going, I'll go for it. For me, the thing that stretched my mind the most, and I was quite quiet in that part of the discussion because I want to give this more thought, is the poverty paradox and the idea that where is the focus? And I think I've tended to really be one of those more practical people that sees the problem and then wants to solve the problem. But then I believe so much in the Zuma effect, where you give something so negative so much energy and so much power, and the Trump effect, and you give it so much energy and thereby give it so much power. So I actually have never applied that in the context of solutions and possibility and imagination. So thanks for that insight. That's something I'm going to be pondering on for the next while.
That's fantastic, Adila. Thank you. Anything else?
I think my takeaway from this last module has been just to, as you're starting up your business, to get a really good idea about what your purpose is, and to align your business around that before you think about your products or competition or anything like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. Khotso, Daniel?
I don't feel very equipped to comment because I wasn't here for most of it, but I must say, whenever I jumped in, it sounded like the conversation was intense and deep the whole way through. So I'm just really glad that I mean, this seems to be a great platform to discuss things and work things out. I'm really excited about the rest of the course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Khotso.
Two things on my side. So one is I really like the conversation about responsible entrepreneurship. Just oddly enough, because I usually hate conversations about ethics, I've always hated those conversations. But I think this took a very, very broad view on things, and that was very enriching. And the second thing is I just wanted to quickly share my screen and announce what the discussions will look like online when we post questions on the forum, so everyone can participate. I wanted to just quickly show everyone, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So let's see.
Sorry, I need to jump off and leave, so I'm going to leave you there. But thanks very much, everyone.
Sure.
Thank
can
you so much.
Bye, Daniel.
Bye-bye.
Everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Sure.
I can.
So for module 1, maybe just to continue this conversation offline, we've asked a question on misconceptions of entrepreneurship. And an interesting question that I posted, maybe it's not interesting, who knows, is South Africa's ecosystem ageist? So you could just have a look at that and post your view. And then at some point, either Rachel, Daniel, or I will also post a question in module 2. That's it on my side.
Okay.
Cool.
Take it.
Great. My key takeaway, honestly, is just a sense of gratitude. I'm always amazed when 2 or 3 minds come together, the things that we can create in terms of knowledge. So I'm thankful. I find myself thankful even as a facilitator, just to have been in the presence of such brilliance. So thank you all. So next week, I mean, not next week, the week after next, we'll be back again, same time, 6:30, to talk about Africa's development trajectory. We are hoping that we can get a guest online with us who is an expert in this space. So hopefully that will make the conversation even more exciting. The idea is that I'm not the only facilitator here. I actually can bring in real expertise, people who have perspectives, lived experiences, so that we can enrich the conversation. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get him to come and join us. So we'll announce who that is. I don't know if it's already on their Khotso, but I would become to say who it is once he's accepted, if he accepts.
Yeah, and maybe just to Rachel's point, so we'll try our best to have a few guest speakers, 2 or 3, at some point during the course. But once they accept, then we'll announce.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Rachel.
No problem. Thank you so much, guys. We've kept you 7 minutes longer. I'm trying to start and finish on time, so my apologies for that. I wish you all a great next 2 weeks, and as someone once said, may you live in interesting times. I'm with you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.